came to develop his theory of natural selection, and we ended by summarizing the most salient points of that theory. Let me remind you that Darwin's main contribution was not to establish that evolution occurs. I mean, he helped in that regard, but instead to propose natural selection as a mechanism by which evolution could occur. Now, in a nutshell, Darwin's theory of natural selection runs as follows. There's variation in population. Some of the traits that individuals have in populations are heritable, meaning that this variation can be transmitted genetically from parents to offspring. More individuals are born in a population than can survive, meaning that only some individuals will survive and reproduce. And individuals that do survive and reproduce are not a random subset of the population, but instead those individuals possessing traits that somehow make them better at surviving and reproducing in a particular environment. To the extent that the traits that do so, we call these adaptive traits, are heritable, those heritable adaptive traits will become increasingly represented in a population over time and thus shape the phenotypic characteristics of that population. And that's the process of evolution. Now, there are a couple of additional points I want to make about Darwin's theory of natural selection at this point. The first point is to remind you that natural selection can only act on existing heritable variation. If there's no variation for a particular trait, then selection simply cannot do anything with it. This is why the generation of variation that we've discussed earlier in the context of mutation and genetic recombination is so central to our understanding of evolution. The second point I want to make is that although natural selection acts on individuals, its evolutionary consequences occur in populations. Individuals do not evolve. Instead, evolution is measured as changes in the average characteristics of individuals within a population. Thus, as we begin to talk about evolution and evolutionary mechanisms, we're really making another transition in the hierarchy of biological organization that I introduced at the beginning of the course. A transition from the level of individual organisms, which is the level at which we were discussing Mendelian genetics, to the level of populations of organisms. And it's this point that brings us to today's lecture, in which we're going to look at some examples that illustrate how evolution occurs in populations. Now, we call natural selection a theory, but it's a testable theory, and it's been tested many times. Darwin, in fact, when he proposed the theory, really could only turn to examples of artificial selection, the breeding of domesticated plants and animals, where the selective agent was the breeder, not the environment. Since Darwin's time, however, natural selection has been demonstrated to occur in many, many cases, actually well-documented examples, both in wild populations and in laboratory populations under more controlled circumstances. In this lecture, we're going to take a closer look at a couple of examples in order to better understand how natural selection works. Now, the first example I'll use is a famous one. Actually, it may even be called an infamous one, which involves a small moth living in England, the English peppered moth, with the scientific name Biston bicellaria. This example is notable not because it offers definitive proof for natural selection occurring, as we'll see the direct evidence for this in this case is incomplete, but instead because it was the first widely publicized of natural selection occurring in a wild population over a relatively short time scale, as opposed to being inferred from long-term patterns occurring over a geological time scale. It also provides a good example for illustrating some of the key tenets of natural selection. Well, butterfly collectors are quite a zealous group of natural historians. For literally hundreds of years, professional and amateur entomologists have collected hundreds of thousands, if not millions of specimens of butterflies and moths from all over the world in order to document variation within populations, between populations, among species, and so forth. As a result, the natural history museums of the world are literally stuffed, filled to the brim with collections that illustrate various patterns of variation in the phenotypes of butterflies and moths, and many other organisms as well. So, in the case of Biston bicellaria, there's an extensive museum collection that extends back over 150 years or more of the occurrence of this moth in England. Now, if you look specifically at the collection of this species that were made near Manchester, England, you'll notice an interesting thing. Moths that were collected before the 1850s were mostly a pale color. That is, they have pale colored wings with just a sprinkling of dark flecks, which is where they get their name, the peppered moth. Now, there are a few examples that you find in these older collections of dark melanic forms, but most of the moths that are collected are light colored. By contrast, if you look at specimens that were collected a half a century later, around 1900, about 98% of the moths collected are uniformly dark colored, and there are only a few light colored individuals represented. So, the typical wing color phenotype in the population of this moth found around Manchester, England, shifted dramatically from mostly light individuals to mostly dark individuals over a 50-year period. Now, it's well established that wing color is a heritable trait in butterflies and moths. Therefore, the historical change in wing color observed in this population may be consistent with a hypothesis that the shift represents an evolutionary change. Interestingly, this transformation from the 1850s to the early part of the 20th century occurred during Darwin's lifetime. But he never knew about it, of course, and in fact, Darwin himself even despaired as to whether one could ever document in a natural population the phenomenon of natural selection. Now, if this change in wing color is an evolutionary transformation, then based on what we know so far, we would expect that natural selection must be acting on these individuals because of their wing color. How might natural selection act in this way? Well, it was in the mid-1950s when an English physician named H.B.D. Kettlewell proposed the following idea. He noticed that the change in moth coloration correlated with the onset of the Industrial Revolution in England. This was a time when coal burning around industrial centers like Manchester produced enormous amount of soot, and this soot settled on everything. Now, the peppered moth is a night-flying moth, and it usually spends the whole day resting on tree trunks. Normally, in the English countryside, these tree trunks that the moth would settle on are covered with light-colored lichens. Well, what Kettlewell suggested was that the tree trunks around Manchester, England, because they became soot-covered, and indeed they did, we can document this, had become considerably darker. Now, what's natural selection doing here? Kettlewell argued that visual predators, such as birds, were hunting these moths during the day. Moths were light-colored, he argued, because when they rested on light-colored lichens, they were cryptic. They couldn't be seen. But what happened when the bark turned dark because of soot was that the light-colored individuals now stood out like a sore thumb, and they were easily found by predators. On the other hand, those few dark-colored individuals that occurred would do much better because their dark coloration would fit in with the now dark background on which they were alighting. So, Kettlewell proposed that natural selection was acting on wing color because of the actions of visual predators that were able to find these individual moths depending on their contrast with their environment. This is a testable hypothesis. Well, in theory, it's a testable hypothesis. I mean, it's a little bit hard to test this, but Kettlewell tried to test it the following way. What he did was he took an equal number of dark-colored and light-colored moths and released them into two kinds of woods. He would release an equal number of dark-colored and light-colored moths into woods that were still darkened with soot. And then he would ask which of the moths got eaten more. And when he did this, he reported, he found out that, as he would have expected, the light-colored moths were the ones that were getting eaten because the dark-colored moths were cryptic. Now, if he took the same number of light and dark-colored moths and he put them instead in a forest that was more distant from Manchester, where the bark was still light-colored, he'd get the opposite effect. In this case, the dark-colored moths would stand out in the background, and the birds would find them and eat them much more than the light-colored moths. Now, the results of Kettlewell's experiments are consistent with the idea that natural selection, caused by visual predators hunting these animals as they are trying to hide during the day, natural selection is acting on wing color such that over time, as the bark became darker, the darker individuals were favored. and therefore left more offspring, which carried alleles for the dark coloration, and dark coloration spread through the population. Now, this example of the peppered moth is a famous one because at the time it was published, it was considered to be the first conclusively demonstrated example of natural selection occurring in a wild population. I must tell you, however, that this example is also a bit infamous nowadays, because in recent years it's been suggested that Kettlewell actually might not have done this experiment as neatly as he could. Specifically, it appears that Kettlewell didn't actually just release these moths. In fact, he said this. He didn't just release them into the environment. He actually attached them to the bark. I mean, he had to know where they were. He had to count them. So he'd take a bunch of moths and he'd stick them on tree trunks. And this is problematic because the moths weren't choosing where to land. Kettlewell was choosing where to land. So a number of people have argued that this was a very poorly conducted experiment and argued that, in fact, Kettlewell at the time overinterpreted his results, specifically because he and the geneticists who were interested in his work really wanted to support natural selection. In fact, one leading evolutionary biologist now has quipped that Kettlewell's work could never be published today. Certainly, his experiment isn't conclusive evidence that natural selection occurred in this population, but I still think this is a useful example if you just allow me to assume that selection is acting this way, because it illustrates some important points about how selection does act. And those points are what I want to address now. The first point illustrated here is the requirement that there must be heritable variation. If we had started out with a population of moths that were all white, and there was no variation, there were no dark-colored individuals, then we wouldn't predict that population to respond to natural selection, because there were no dark individuals to be favored. The second point I want to make concerns our interpretation of how natural selection acted on these moths, if indeed it did, as Kettlewell proposed. Now, we might think that the way natural selection is acting is because one type of the moth is getting eaten more frequently than the other type. And indeed that's true, but that's not actually the important point here. The fact is that natural selection results from differential reproduction between two different kinds of organisms in a population. So the fact that the moths were eaten itself isn't what's important. It's the fact that because they were eaten, they couldn't reproduce. Now, this may be subtle or it may seem obvious, but it's an important point to keep in mind when you think about selection, and we're going to come back to that in a second. You might actually think about a thought experiment when you're thinking about this. What do you think would happen if these moths were predated, were eaten by birds, only when they were much older? Imagine a circumstance where younger moths, in fact, for whatever reason, maybe because they were hiding in completely different places, were not subject to predation. It was only the older moths where there was a differential survival because of their color. And in fact, these older moths had already completed most of their reproduction. If that was happening, we wouldn't expect natural selection to occur either. Even though the moths are getting eaten depending on their color, if they've done most of their reproduction, if they're past their reproductive period, it doesn't matter. Natural selection only acts because it affects reproduction. Now, this idea leads to my last point, which is to explicitly define what we mean by the term evolutionary fitness, or what we sometimes refer to as Darwinian fitness. Popular accounts of evolution often describe natural selection as the survival of the fittest. What does fittest mean? Sometimes people think this expression implies that selection occurs as direct competition among individuals, nature red and bloody tooth and claw and so forth. But this isn't really the case. Darwinian fitness is more correctly defined in terms of the relative contribution of individuals to the genetic makeup of future populations. This means that fitness is measured explicitly in terms of reproductive success. When we want to ask about the fitness of an individual, what we really need to do is to ask, how many offspring does it produce? But this isn't enough, because it doesn't matter how many offspring you produce in and of itself. It matters how many offspring you produce relative to other individuals in your population. Imagine I told you, for example, that some individual produced 10 offspring in its lifetime. Is this a fit individual? Well, I mean, it depends. It depends on what the other individuals of the population are doing. If we're talking about an albatross, where most individuals only produce a few offspring in their whole lifetime, then this would be a very fit individual because it's producing a lot more than a few. If we're talking about a Drosophila fruit fly, which can produce hundreds of individuals in just one breeding event, then we're talking about a fairly unfit individual. My point is that it's necessary to define fitness in terms of relative reproductive success relative to other individuals in the population. But we still have to make one more addition to our definition of fitness to explicitly include the role of the environment. Fitness is not an intrinsic property of an individual, or even of an individual within a population. Instead, it's a property of the individual in a particular environment. Remember back to Kettlewell's moth example. The dark-colored moths did better if the tree trunks were dark-colored, whereas the white-colored moths did better if the tree trunks were light-colored. It wasn't that dark was inherently better than light in and of itself. It was only that dark might be better than light in a given environment. So this means that what we have to do is define Darwinian fitness in terms of relative reproductive success in a given environment. Well, let me pick up on this particular point, which emphasizes the role of the environment, with a second example of natural selection being observed in a wild population. In the last lecture, I told you that Darwin's thinking about natural selection and evolution was profoundly influenced by his observations of island organisms on his round-the-world voyage on the Beagle, among which were a remarkable group of birds that he observed in the Galapagos Islands, collectively now known as Darwin's finches. One of the best studied examples of natural selection occurring in the wild comes from the work of Peter Grant and Rosemary Grant at Princeton University, who have been studying one species of Darwin's finch for over 3 decades now. Remember that the different species of finches are all very similar in their size, shape, and color, but they differ especially in the size and shape of their beaks, consistent with the idea that natural selection has adapted the beaks of these different species to be specialized for eating different kinds of foods found in the different habitats on the different islands. There's also considerable variation within species in the size and shape of individuals' beaks. Now, if natural selection is responsible for the evolution of beak shape in this group of birds, then we should also be able to detect differences in the survivorship and especially reproductive success of individuals within a species if they vary in their beak shape within the species. Now, it might seem remarkable to think that we could actually catch this, that we could actually observe and detect this kind of differential reproductive success occurring in a natural population of birds. But this is exactly what the work of the Grants has revealed, with the help of a lot of painstaking fieldwork over 3 decades, and also with the help of a little luck from the weather. Let me explain. The Grants have focused much of their work on one population of a single species of Darwin's finch, the so-called medium ground finch. This is a pretty inelegant name, but that's what it's called. The scientific name for this species is Geospiza fortis. Now, the population of this finch that the Grants have studied is ideal for this kind of long-term study of populations because it occurs on a relatively small island, and the population size never gets above about 1,000 individuals. This makes it possible to capture and mark and measure almost every bird in the population. Now, like many of the Darwin's finches, the medium ground finch's diet consists primarily of seeds, which it cracks open with its beaks. The Grants and many of their students and other researchers now have shown that both within this particular species, as well as you would expect across different species of seed-eating finch, the size of the beak actually corresponds to the size and the hardness of the seeds that they usually eat, with larger beaks corresponding to larger, harder seeds, as you might predict. Now, within the population of the medium ground finch that the Grants have been studying, there is considerable variation in beak size. Most individuals have sort of average-sized beaks. These beaks would be, if you measured them from the top to the bottom, about 9.5 millimeters deep. Depth is what is often measured when you're measuring beak sizes in birds because it's a convenient measure of the overall size of the structure. Some birds in the population, however, have beaks with depths as large as 13 or 14 millimeters, and other individuals have beaks with depths that are as small as only 6 or 7 millimeters. In other words, there's actually about a twofold difference in the variation of the beak size in this population of finches. Now, the other thing that the Grants were interested in understanding as they were looking at this population in detail was whether this variation in beak size was heritable. In the case of the moth wing color trait we just discussed, it had been established for many years that this was heritable, but beak size is a little more subtle, and you can imagine that many factors, both genetic factors and environmental factors, could contribute to the size of an individual's beak. So it's difficult to determine easily how heritable this size is. But it's possible, and it's possible to do this by statistically comparing related individuals if you have a large enough sample through a formal process called heritability analysis. I mean, in a nutshell, what heritability analysis is asking is whether there is a correlation, in spite of all of the variation that might exist in the population, between, say, fathers and sons. And if you have a large enough sample, you can actually determine how much of that correlation could be due to genetic heritability. I won't go into the details other than to say that when the Grants did this with their rather large sample, they did find that beak size is heritable in these medium ground finches. So the evidence all points to the possibility that natural selection may be occurring on beak shape as an adaptation for feeding in this group, in particular with the size of the beak being adaptive for the size of the seeds being eaten. This is similar to the inference we made for the English moth, that selection, the English peppered moth, that selection may be acting. How could the Grants actually test this? This is where a bit of serendipity and bad weather came into play. In 1977, after the Grants had been studying this population for a number of years, there was a severe drought in the Galapagos brought on by an El Nino weather pattern. This drought had a profound effect on the population. Over 80% of the population died, leaving less than 200 birds as survivors. Now, the reason for this decrease in population size clearly was because the finches didn't have enough food to eat. Specifically, the drought caused many of the plants that produce the seeds they normally eat to cease flowering. And for a year or so, the plants didn't flower, they didn't produce seeds, and the finches simply didn't have enough to eat. In fact, many emaciated dead birds were found at this time, consistent with the idea that they had simply starved to death. The Grants' most important observation, however, was that the individuals who survived the drought differed from those who didn't survive, specifically in the size of their beaks. The individuals who made it had larger beaks than the individuals who didn't make it. Why should this be? Why should larger beaked individuals have survived the drought? The reason is because the type of seed produced that were available for these individual or for this population to eat also were affected differentially by the drought. Specifically, one kind of plant proved to be drought resistant and thus did flower and produce some seeds. But this plant produced very large and hard seeds. So the food that was available were all larger, harder seeds that only the birds with larger beaks were able to eat efficiently. Following this drought in 1977, the distribution of beak size in this population of medium ground finches shifted dramatically so that the average individual in a couple of years had a much larger beak than the average individual had had before the drought. In other words, the selection brought on by this drought had changed the population's mean characteristics, had caused evolution to occur specifically for beak shape. Now, the 1977 drought, it turns out, wasn't a unique event. The Galapagos are subject to periodic droughts and also wet spells brought on by El Nino-like events. And these rainfall differences have occurred on a semi-regular basis every several years after the original drought that the Grants observed. And in general, what they've found is that following a drought, when there are more hard, large seeds available, the population's mean beak size will shift to larger sizes. Following a wet year, however, when a lot of small, soft seeds are produced, the population will have its mean beak size actually shift back down. So selection is pushing the characteristics of this population one way or another in a way that's predicted by the particular adaptation of beak morphology to feeding ecology in this population of birds. Okay, so now we've looked at a couple of examples of natural selection occurring in wild populations of organisms. And if we had the time, we could talk about any number of other examples. I mean, I could think off the top of my head of 2 or 3 that are equally as compelling as the study that the grants have done, and many others that may not be as complete and long-term as the grants work, but nonetheless provide convincing evidence that natural selection can change the characteristics of a population, thus causing that population to evolve. Now, there are another class of examples that are much studied these days, involving not natural selection occurring in wild populations of things like birds, but in fact natural selection occurring in organisms that affect human health and welfare very directly. For example, I'm sure you've all heard about the problem of the increasing number of strains of disease-causing bacteria that are being found to be resistant to antibiotics. For example, the appearance of antibiotic-resistant strains of the bacteria responsible for tuberculosis makes this case. In the early part of the 20th century, tuberculosis was a major health problem in the US and elsewhere, responsible for as many deaths as cancer is today. In the 1950s, however, as was the case for many bacterial diseases, antibiotics were developed that could effectively control the disease and virtually wiped it out in industrialized countries. Antibiotics, by the way, are just any number of agents, usually natural products, that are used to treat bacterial disease by directly killing the disease-causing organism itself. Then, in the 1980s, there were an increasing number of tuberculosis cases reported. And what was most troubling about these cases is that the patients who had the disease were not responding to the antibiotics that had previously been effective. Presumably, what had happened was that the disease-causing bacteria, the tuberculosis bacteria itself, had somehow evolved to become resistant to the antibiotic. How could that have worked? Well, here's how it works. When you take antibiotics to rid yourself of some bacterial disease, you're essentially potentially performing a natural selection experiment in your own body. The point of the antibiotics is to kill the disease-causing organisms. But let's say you don't get them all. Let's say that there are a few bacteria that are left. Now, what's going to happen is you might feel better. Most of the bacteria are dead. You no longer have the disease as far as you're concerned, but some of those bacteria remain alive in your body. Which bacteria have survived the antibiotic? The ones that happen to, by chance, have some traits that made them more resistant to the effects of that antibiotic. So if these bacteria then survive and reproduce, the population trait for resistance to that antibiotic will increase, and the bacteria will have evolved some degree of resistance. This, by the way, is why physicians tell us to completely finish any course of antibiotics we're given. The point is to kill every single bacterial cell, not most of them. Because if you only kill most of them, you're performing natural selection on the bacterial population and encouraging the evolution of antibiotic resistance. We face similar problems, actually, with the evolution of pesticide-resistant insects. It's the same thing. If we use a pesticide that kills most but not all of a particular pest species, the individuals that remain will be those that happen to have traits that made them more resistant to the pesticide. And natural selection, again, will lead to the evolution of pesticide resistance in that species. An astonishing, perhaps frightening number of pesticide-resistant strains of pest insects have evolved this way in the last several decades. In fact, by some estimates, most individuals across the world for some species of pest insect carry some genes for resistance to common pesticides that evolved long ago and have spread throughout the entire species. Well, now that we've looked at some examples of natural selection, we're in a good position to develop more completely our understanding of how populations evolve over time. To do that, we have to begin to understand how we can model changes in the genetic makeup of a population, or what we'll call a gene pool. And that's the subject we'll turn to in the next lecture.